Back on. Hi everybody, like Alex said, I'm Soti and I run a business called Data Chronicle. And today I'm going to talk to you about data storytelling. I'm going to talk about some of the consequences if you don't tell stories with data. I'll talk about some of the benefits if you do, and also I'll then talk about how you can go about doing that yourself. Before I do that, a little background. First, I started this business because I was really passionate about data and turning basic information into pictures. My background is I started my career as a web developer, programming PHP, Perl, HTML, JavaScript, that kind of thing, working closely alongside designers. After a few years, I then went on to become a business analyst where I specialize in SQL Server, churning out reports and that kind of thing. And after that, I worked for a climate change think tank where I looked after their CRM database in their marketing department. But all through that, what I realized was every time I was producing reports and giving it to people, whenever I gave them the Excel number-based reports, I got a mixed kind of response, which was fine. But whenever I put some time into visualizing it, I got a lot more engagement. People asked me a lot more questions, that kind of thing, which is why I ended up starting my own business. We've been going for about 3.5 years now. And yeah, that's my background. So, why tell stories with data? Why should we do that? Because you do have to put a little bit of effort into it. It's definitely the harder thing to do as opposed to the easy thing to do when it comes to data. I don't know if you've got this experience, but before I started telling stories with data, what I would do was I would look at my data, analyze it, find some gems, find something that really excited me, and I thought, great, brilliant, I've got to share this. Could be Fitbit data, could be something to do with my company, could be something to do with my job when I used to work with someone else. And I'd run and find a boss or a colleague and show it to them, and usually I'd get one of these kind of responses. I wouldn't say the first guy, I wouldn't say the second lady either, that's a bit extreme. But generally the guy in the middle I got quite a lot of. This kind of like glazed over look as if to say, what are you talking about? And I often got the guy in the end as well, which is a kind of like, should I know something about this? Should I know more than I'm letting on kind of thing, but I don't. So I decided to, do you know what? I should put more effort into this. I think that if you put more effort into telling data stories, they will help you to engage, entertain, and to change the future. Yes, I know that is a big claim, change the future. Because essentially, with data stories, what you're trying to do, you're trying to make an impact. You're trying to influence people. You're trying to make things happen. You're trying to show what you see and communicate it to people. Before I get into that, let me take a step back and talk about stories. So let's forget the data and let's just talk about stories. Why do we all love stories? Human beings are wired for stories. We've beloved stories since day one. Whether you're a little kid and the little stories, whether you're a grandpa, we all love stories. But why do we love stories? Well, we love stories because we're wired that way. They engage our senses, number one. They make us wake up and take notice. It's our way of making sense of the world. Two, they bring us together. Now, I know we don't generally sit all around the campfire as much as we used to in days gone by, but whether you're at work by the coffee machine or at a dinner party or down the pub, stories bring us all together. That's all people do, is constantly telling people stories. We even tell ourselves stories when we're not with anyone else. Stories move us to feel. Now, a lot of us think that we make a lot of decisions with the rational part of our brain, with the logical part of it. We think we do, but actually there's a lot of research that says we don't. We actually make decisions based on our emotions. We think we're being logical, but when it comes right down to it, we go with what we feel like is a good choice. And finally, stories move us to act. Whenever we hear a story, we tend to put ourselves in that position, in that situation, and think, what would I do? And as a result, we either do something or not. If you dumped a whole lot of data on someone and said, hey, check this out, this is great, They might give it time and day and go, this is interesting, but at the end of it, they're just going to go, okay, I'll come back to that. But they won't actually do anything with it. You have to put it together and tell a story before they can then take that next step to actually do something. So why now? Why do I believe data storytelling is such a critical thing to do now? Well, one of the reasons is because of this. As you all know, we all live in a very digital world. We are bombarded with notifications, advertising all day long. This infographic shows some information about the amount of data that's shared on the internet every minute of every day. And this is in fact 2018 data, so this is a year old. To give an example, every minute of every day there are 49,000 Instagram photos posted. Every minute there are 13 million text messages sent, and every minute there are 470,000 tweets sent. And that's just 3. That's not even all the stuff around that infographic. There's so much information going on. Bearing that in mind, turns out we are also inherently visual creatures. We love visuals. 50% of our brains are dedicated to visual processing. It takes us only 1/10 of a second to grasp a visual scene. That means you see a scene, a part of your brain works out what's going on, decides whether you're going to flee or fight or fight or flight, before you're consciously aware of what's going on. So bearing in mind what I said about information overload and distractions, and the fact that we're visual creatures, you put these two things together, and I think infographics or data visualizations play a big role. Now, has everyone here heard of what infographics are? Or data visualizations? Had to ask. I often get asked, what's the difference between an infographic or data visualization? Now, the truth is, some people use the terms interchangeably. But really, an infographic is a graphical representation of data with the purpose of telling a story. Ultimately, an infographic is subjective, because you're telling a story from the perspective of your perspective or whoever you're creating an infographic for. However, a data visualization is, or should be, objective. It is a graphical representation of the raw data. So if you look at this, put the whole team, all of the data visualizations and some text and illustrations together, you get an infographic. Whereas if you break out these things on the side, these charts, well, those are what we call data visualizations. That's all well and good. So how do we tie this in to telling stories? Well, this is how you go about telling stories with data. I'm going to go through these in a second, but just to sort of show you the different stages. A, you've got to know your goal. B, you've got to know your audience inside out. C, you've got to know how stories are structured. Then you've got to look at your charts. And then you've got to structure your slides. Now, your slides are only there if you're doing a formal kind of presentation. If you're doing it on the web or telling it in person, well, that's different. You don't need slides for that. But we'll go through that briefly as well. And ultimately, you should always keep it simple. Right, knowing your goal. When you start off telling a data story, you need to know what you're trying to achieve. I know that sounds really obvious, but you'd be amazed how many times, myself included, you get some really cool data or a really cool dashboard and you think, wow, this is great. And you start exploring and you're finding this out and finding that out and making links to here, this, here, that, and everywhere. And the reality is, if you didn't start with a clear goal, you can end up getting data and trying to make the data fit the narrative you're trying to tell, which never works. You've got to work the other way around. You've got to go, what am I trying to achieve? What is my goal? Be very clear about that. And then you go and try and find the data to support that. Even if you don't find data to support that, it's better to have a little bit of data supporting it and some holes in your data. At least then you can report back and go, we're missing data here. We need to collect this data. But that way you stay on track. Otherwise, it's very easy to get lost in the labyrinth of, this is really cool, oh, I wonder about that. And you can make links forever and a year and a day. Your audience. absolutely critical. Is your audience Generation Z? Are they baby boomers? Are they really savvy with the internet? Have they got their own urban slang? Are they really techie? Will they understand the acronyms you're trying to use? Or are they really specialist sectors like lawyers or academics, where they've got their own kind of like niche language? If you're aware of that, you only have to use a few of their colloquialisms, and if you put that into the communication with the data, it really goes a long way. The people in your audience really feel like, wow, this person really is almost one of us. They understand our language. They get where I'm coming from. The next thing I'd like to talk about is story structure. So let's forget what we talked about before and just look at how stories go. Now this is a very basic blueprint of how stories work. There's a beginning, a middle, and end. And in the beginning, we talk about a situation. And usually there's a hero. The hero is introduced, the scene is set, they give us a little bit of background information, and a hint at the few challenges or whatever the hero is going to face. A little bit of time goes by, we get to the middle of the story, and then we get the conflict, we get the struggles, and we get the challenges. Generally, this is where the hero is introduced to their nemesis. Take the example of Luke Skywalker. In the beginning of Star Wars, he's minding his own business, living with his auntie and uncle in, I can't remember what the planet was called. And then one day he wakes up, all hell breaks loose, his family's killed, he's got serious problems. So now he's on the journey. It's interesting to remember that whenever people hear stories, everybody generally, instinctively, places themselves as the hero. We do, right? We can't help it. Because we always put ourselves generally in that situation and think, what would I do or how would I react? And then we can learn from it. As the hero goes through the journey and they meet struggles and that kind of thing, they need to learn new skills to overcome their challenges and defeat their nemesis. In comes the sage. In Star Wars, Yoda. Yoda comes to the rescue, takes the young Padawan, Luke Skywalker, under his wing and starts to train him. Luke has challenges and fights, but ultimately he learns new skills, and then he faces one more big challenge, which is to face Darth Vader. When you're telling stories, I know as much as we like to be the hero, it's better for you to see your role as the sage, or as the mentor, the guardian, as Yoda. Your boss could be the hero. It's in your interest to make your boss the hero. Or your clients could be the hero, and you're the one guiding them along the way and helping them and teaching them the new skills to overcome whatever challenges that they face. And finally, in the last scene of the story, the hero has learned all these skills, they are transformed, they finally face their nemesis, they defeat them, all is well, and they live happily ever after. That's the basic kind of story structure, right? That sounds great. And sometimes you might think, how am I going to use that to my day-to-day kind of job? It's a similar kind of thing. You kind of think of the challenge, you've got to think of what we need to do along the way to make things better, and then you need to talk about the resolution and how we're going to get there. It's very similar kind of format. If you put things in that order, people tend to absorb the information a lot quicker, and they can form patterns in their head, and they get it a lot quicker. Back to data. Right, how to pimp your chart. As I mentioned earlier in the infographic and data visualizations slide, data visualizations form a big part of communicating data. And of course, they're charts, they're visuals. These elements help you pimp your chart, essentially. A title, text, layout, color, and the lines, and don't make them think. I'm going to give you an example just after this, so I'll talk through some of these points in a second. An important one I want to talk about is the don't make them think. A lot of you will recognize that from the old web. What is it, a book that came out in the 90s or something? Don't Make Me Think, which is about web design, how you can go about usability, UX designing. It's a similar thought of concept when it comes to infographics or data visualizations. In true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I did earlier. Now this chart is a housing data chart, which I got from a report somewhere, I forget where. And I looked at it and I immediately started squinting. I couldn't understand why it was there, what it was about. Turns out it was looking at house prices in Wales, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland from 2005 to 2017. When I looked at the data and looked at some background information, I finally figured out what the whole point of the chart was for. So this is how I pimped it up. That title didn't really say anything to me, average house price by UK, blah, 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 blah. So I just put it in bold there. England has seen the greatest increase in house prices of all the UK home countries since January 2005. Boom, straight away. That's the point of that chart that the person in that report was trying to make. Don't just put it there so people have to work out what's going on. Actually tell them, hold their hands and put it up front. There's a little bit of information that gives some background, textual information as to what the chart is there for and everything. You're essentially highlighting what's going on in this chart. So once someone's read that, they're like, oh great, I get it, I see it now. Also, with a lot of defaults charts in Excel, especially, because that's the most commonly used charting software, you get a lot of lines. You get a line along the axis there and there. Get rid of those, they just distract. You also get default lines that go across there all the time, all the incremental measurements. Get rid of them, they're just distracting. You want to make it as plain as possible to the person to see what you're trying to do. The whole point of this chart was to show that England was the fastest growing home country that had the fastest growing house prices. Well, in that case, highlight it in a color that stands out so they can see it. Label it so they know which one they're looking at. So they don't have to look at the legend and come back and work out what each line means. And all the other ones will then gray them out because they're not that important. If someone wants to look at it, well then they can look at it and see for themselves. But if that's not the purpose or the point of what you're trying to do, gray it out. You've got to look at it this way. People will easily get distracted if you don't use a color unless it means something. If the color doesn't mean something, get rid of the color. Make it as plain as possible for people to see. When you put all of that together, and if you're doing a formal presentation and you're going to put slides together, have I really not, what's the time? Right. To structure your slides, this is a suggested structure. You have a title slide, a contents table. Now, a contents table is only if it's a formal presentation. I haven't got one today because this isn't that kind of a formal kind of presentation. But if you were in an office and you were doing a presentation for the department or that kind of thing, if it's appropriate, by all means, it's a good idea. You have an intro or an executive summary, once again, depending on how formal the meeting is. And then you've got these different actions. And if you like, these are the different stages in the story. And within each of these actions, you've got what, why, and how. So you keep going back and forth between what, why, and how as you are communicating to your audience, who's either your boss, your colleagues, or your clients, the information about the data you've highlighted and how that relates to their issue or current problems. And finally, you'd end up with a summary at the end of what you've just covered and why, that sort of thing. Now that's all put together, some tools and resources that can help you along your way to put together these data stories. I'm going to whiz through these. Some of you will be very familiar with some of these. At the top, you've got Adobe Illustrator. Now, Adobe Illustrator is fantastic, the market-leading illustration software. It's for the pros, not for the beginner. It's expensive, but it's very good. We've also got Photoshop. For data visualizations and infographics, I wouldn't really recommend Photoshop or GIMP or any kind of like graphic software like that. Mostly because they're very unforgiving. You kind of need to know exactly what you're doing when you do it. If you do it wrong, trying to go backwards or reshape something, it's really difficult. But if you were really handy with it and you were a designer to start off with, well then, yeah, by all means, go ahead. Canva is one of my personal favorites. Has anyone here heard of Canva? Canva is an online free and, was it freemium? Software as a service tool, a graphics tool. Really, really easy to use. You don't need any skills. It's free to sign up. So after a while, when you want to start, like for instance, downloading high quality res pictures, then they charge. But it's very, very affordable. Really, really good piece of software, I recommend it. Plus they've got templates. You can use this to do your presentations, as well as infographics and designs and cards and event flyers and all sorts of things. Next thing along is another one of my favorites is Inkscape. Anyone heard of Inkscape? Inkscape is another one of my, well, it's actually my personal favorite. Inkscape is basically an open source, free alternative to Adobe Illustrator. I've been using it for a number of years now, and there's not a lot of things that you can do with Illustrator that you can't do with Inkscape. It just does it in another kind of way, basically. D3 is a JavaScript graphics library that is used to create graphics on the web, HTML5 graphics, interactive graphics, maps, interactive charts, that kind of thing. It's a free library. I'm sure you guys could crush it as you're all coders, but yeah, not for the faint-hearted, but yeah, very, very, very good piece of software. Good old Excel, another one of my favorites. Excel is fantastic. I use it to do all my data analysis, and I've used all kinds of software from Tableau to Power to all this other fancy stuff. And in the end, I come back to mostly I use Excel. Now, I'm sure most of you don't know, as you know, sorry. The only thing Excel is not good at is dealing with CSV files. It's a pain. So for that, I use OpenCalc, which is infinitely way better than Excel dealing with CSVs. But other than that, I do most of my stuff in Excel to start off with. Infograph is a online, free again, but paid for some services, infographic creation tool. It's kind of a drag and drop interface that allows you to create infographics, really good. Mapbox is a Google Map style application, really good for helping you create and annotate maps, very easy to use. Of course, PowerPoint. PowerPoint isn't good, but it isn't bad either. I think there's a lot of people who don't really know how to use PowerPoint, so you get that general PowerPoint look. One thing I'll suggest to you guys is when you're doing your presentations or your charting in Excel or PowerPoint, try and get away from the defaults. As soon as you get a default, if you put just like 10 minutes after it, and just to get rid of the default colors, change it up, really goes a long way. Because we all recognize those default colors in Excel and PowerPoint. And we all know as soon as we see it. But it doesn't take much effort to just give it that little bit of sparkle that people go, oh right, this is, someone's made more of an effort with this presentation. High charts and Plotly, they are basically kind of like online Excel. They're a lot easier to use in Excel for charting, and I believe they're both free, but don't quote me on that, I'm not entirely sure. And Power BI. Power BI is basically a data analysis, data wrangling, and dashboarding tool for Microsoft, which if you need to do that kind of thing, that's really good. A lot more affordable than Tableau. Some of you may have heard Tableau. Tableau is great, really expensive, but that's great as well. So, regarding tools and resources, there's that. I think I've whisked through this. And yeah, I believe deep down, if I can leave you with one thing today, that if you tell visual stories with data, it'll help your message cut through, make an impact, and change the future.